Before we dive into today's story, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because today we're stepping inside the world's most secure prison. A place designed not just to contain the body but to break the mind. This isn't fiction. This is the real story of ADX Florence, America's Alcatraz of the Rockies. Deep in the mountains of Florence, Colorado, surrounded by razor wire, motion sensors, and sniper towers, stands a concrete fortress unlike any other. Officially, it's called the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, or ADX Florence. Unofficially, it's known as Hell on Earth. Built in 1994 after a series of violent assaults and murders in other federal prisons, ADX was designed to be escape-proof, assault-proof, and perhaps hope-proof. It was the answer to chaos, a solution the Bureau of Prisons believed would restore order to an out-of-control system. But in doing so, they created something darker. A place where punishment evolved into psychological warfare. Every inch of ADX is engineered for control. Inmates live inside 7 by 12-foot concrete cells, sealed with solid steel doors. Meals slide through small slots. The lights never truly go off. Even the mirrors are made of polished steel to prevent shattering. For 23 hours a day, inmates stare at concrete walls. For the remaining hour, they're escorted, alone, into a concrete recreation pen, often called a dog run. There's no yard, no grass, no horizon. Just high walls and a small strip of sky. Psychologists who have studied the facility call it a laboratory of isolation. According to former ADX warden Robert Hood, the place is not designed for humanity. He once said, "It's a clean version of hell." The prisoners inside are some of the most notorious criminals in U.S. history, men whose names made headlines and whose crimes terrified nations. Among them, Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. And Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, Mexico's infamous drug lord. But while ADX Florence was designed for security, it's what happens inside the human mind that defines its legacy. Studies from the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law reveal alarming consequences of long-term solitary confinement. Hallucinations, panic attacks, paranoia, insomnia, hypersensitivity to light and sound, and in extreme cases, psychosis. For many, the silence itself becomes unbearable. Former inmates have described hearing their own heartbeat echo through the concrete. Others said they'd count the tiny holes in the air vents to pass the time. Letters smuggled out describe days blending into weeks, weeks into years, until time itself becomes meaningless. One ex-prisoner, Jack Powers, once wrote, "I forgot what faces looked like. I'd close my eyes and try to picture my mother, but her face would blur, fade, and disappear." Powers eventually became a key witness in a class action lawsuit filed in 2012, Bacote versus Federal Bureau of Prisons, a case that would expose the darkest side of ADX, its treatment of inmates with mental illness. According to court filings, dozens of men suffering from schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and severe PTSD were locked in total isolation, sometimes for years without proper psychiatric care. One plaintiff, John Bacote, claimed he spent more than a decade in near-total solitude. He wrote in his declaration that he would talk to walls and hear voices whispering through the vents. He said, "You start to believe the walls are alive. You start to believe they're talking back." The lawsuit's discovery phase revealed internal Bureau of Prisons emails acknowledging that some prisoners were psychologically deteriorating. Yet, the institution continued to justify their confinement under the label of administrative control. Former prison psychologist Dr. Craig Haney described it as a slow-motion form of psychological torture. He testified that humans are not built to live without social interaction, that the brain, when starved of contact, begins to consume itself. Still, ADX remains in operation, and continues to hold around 350 inmates today. To the outside world, ADX Florence is a symbol of justice and control. But to those inside, it's a monument to silence, darkness, and the limits of the human mind. And this is just the beginning. Each day inside ADX Florence follows a routine so strict, so precise, that even time begins to lose its meaning. The day starts at 6 a.m., when steel doors slide open just enough for a guard to deliver breakfast through a narrow slot. The sound is sharp and mechanical, a quick hiss of hydraulics, then the clang of metal on metal. For most inmates, that sound is the only human connection they'll experience all day. Breakfast is simple: powdered eggs, oatmeal, maybe a slice of fruit. It's served cold more often than not. The tray is withdrawn, the slot closes, and the silence returns. For 23 hours every day, inmates remain locked in their cells, 85 square feet of concrete and steel, with a concrete bed, a desk molded into the wall, and a stool that cannot move. The toilet flushes only a limited number of times per hour, controlled remotely by guards. The sink dispenses lukewarm water. Every detail is calculated, not for comfort but for compliance. Each cell includes a narrow window, only 4 inches wide and 2 feet tall. From inside you can see nothing but a sliver of sky. No horizon, no trees, no mountains, not even another building. The design is intentional, to prevent inmates from orienting themselves, to strip them of a sense of place or direction. According to former warden Robert Hood, even the airflow is manipulated. The ventilation system ensures that inmates cannot communicate through air ducts, he explained. No voices, no echoes, just isolation. Prisoners shower 3 times a week, alone inside a small cage. Recreation too happens in isolation. Each inmate is escorted by 2 guards and a leash dog to an outdoor pen the size of a 1-car garage. It's surrounded by 20-foot concrete walls and covered by steel mesh. Inmates call it the cage. They can see a small patch of blue above them. Sometimes, that glimpse of sky becomes their only reminder that the world still exists. Inside ADX, even mail and phone calls are privileges earned through years of good behavior. Visits are non-contact, separated by bulletproof glass. Communication happens through a small phone receiver bolted to the wall. Some inmates haven't touched another human being in decades. When El Chapo Guzman was transferred to ADX in 2019, reports indicated that his isolation was so complete that even the guards referred to him by number, not name. His cell, identical to others, had no television, no radio, and a heavily restricted reading list. He could not speak to other inmates. For someone used to commanding armies, the silence became its own kind of prison. Former inmates described the daily routine as mind-numbing repetition. Every moment is scheduled, meals at 6 o'clock, 11 o'clock, and 4:30, lights dimmed at 10 p.m. The overhead fluorescent bulb glows for 16 hours a day, bright enough to keep you awake, dim enough to feel like dusk. There's no night sky, no stars. Just concrete shadows and artificial time. Psychologists refer to this condition as stimulus deprivation. Humans need sensory variety, changes in light, sound, texture, and temperature, to maintain mental balance. When those are removed, the brain begins to fabricate its own stimuli. That's when the hallucinations begin. In 2015, a federal court unsealed reports from Dr. Terry Kupers, a psychiatrist who evaluated multiple ADX inmates. He described men who believed their cells were shrinking. Others saw insects crawling on walls that weren't there. Some heard their names whispered through the vents. Kupers wrote, "Prolonged solitary confinement at ADX Florence causes severe psychological harm. Inmates lose the ability to think coherently, to distinguish reality from hallucination, to feel emotion, except despair." One prisoner, Sean Riker, recounted his experience in a rare interview after release. He said, "I used to count every tile on the floor. Then I started hearing tapping, like someone on the other side of the wall. But there was no one there. The sound was inside my head." To prevent self-harm, cells are stripped of any objects that could be used as weapons or nooses. Yet suicides still happen. Between 2000 and 2018, at least 8 confirmed suicides occurred within ADX. Though advocacy groups believe the real number is higher, hidden under medical emergencies or unknown causes. Even without death, the toll is visible. Inmates pace for hours talking to themselves, creating imaginary worlds to survive. Some tear pages from their legal documents just to have something to read over and over again. Federal Bureau of Prisons officials argue that such measures are necessary, that ADX houses terrorists, spies, and murderers who cannot safely exist anywhere else. But human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and the United Nations, disagree. In 2011, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, declared that solitary confinement beyond 15 days could constitute cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. At ADX, 15 days is merely the introduction. The average stay? Over 5 years. Some inmates have been isolated for decades. Behind those concrete walls, punishment isn't measured by physical pain, it's measured by how much of the mind can endure before it collapses. If concrete could whisper, the walls of ADX Florence would tell stories not of violence, but of the slow erosion of sanity. Psychologists call it SHU syndrome, short for Special Housing Unit Syndrome. It's the collection of symptoms that emerge when a human being is locked in near total isolation. The condition was first documented in the 1980s inside California's Pelican Bay prison, but at ADX, it evolved into something far more intense, a long-term, scientifically observable breakdown of the mind. Dr. Craig Haney, one of America's leading prison psychologists, interviewed several ADX inmates under court authorization. He reported that many displayed profound psychological trauma. Some spoke in fragmented sentences, others refused to talk at all. Many had difficulty maintaining eye contact or focusing on simple questions. The effects were consistent with those seen in survivors of torture or extreme sensory deprivation. Haney wrote in one of his reports, "Prisoners in solitary at ADX Florence exist in a state of perpetual mental dislocation. Time dissolves. Self dissolves. What remains is a kind of conscious numbness." He described one inmate who had plastered the walls of his cell with sheets of toilet paper. His way of keeping a sense of change, a reminder that something could move even if he couldn't. Another, Thomas Silverstein, spent 36 years in isolation, one of the longest solitary confinements in U.S. history. Silverstein was initially convicted of killing a correctional officer in 1983. To prevent him from communicating with other prisoners, the Bureau of Prisons placed him in what became known as the Range, a custom-built isolation corridor inside ADX with zero human contact. He died there in 2019. In letters released after his death, Silverstein wrote that silence became both his companion and his tormentor. "I feel like I've been buried alive. I talk to the walls because they're the only thing that listens." The Bacote v. BOP lawsuit brought many such stories to light. Psychiatric evaluations revealed that some inmates smeared feces on themselves, others screamed through the night, and several engaged in self-harm simply to feel something. Court documents showed that one inmate, Jose Vega, repeatedly asked for mental health treatment but was denied because he was classified as disciplinary, not medical. He later attempted suicide by swallowing batteries. Another man, Joseph Garcia, slit his wrists using the edge of a food tray. Both incidents occurred inside ADX's control units. A correctional officer who later spoke under anonymity described the atmosphere as eerily quiet until it wasn't. He recalled walking past a cell where an inmate was laughing hysterically, alone in total darkness. "He'd been laughing for hours," the guard said. "It wasn't joy. It was like the kind of laughter that comes when your brain breaks." For the Bureau of Prisons, ADX's philosophy is rooted in total control. The idea is that isolation will break a prisoner's will to resist authority, reducing violence and ensuring compliance. Yet, research shows the opposite effect. Prolonged solitary confinement increases the risk of aggression, paranoia, and psychosis. A 2014 study published in the American Journal of Public Health found that inmates held in isolation were 7 times more likely to harm themselves than those in general population. Even more alarming, suicide rates in solitary confinement were nearly 20 times higher. These statistics reached the attention of federal judges, leading to small but notable reforms. In 2015, as part of a settlement in Bacote v. BOP, the government agreed to transfer several mentally ill prisoners out of ADX Florence to specialized treatment facilities. The settlement acknowledged for the first time that ADX was not suitable for inmates with serious psychiatric disorders. But the question remained, what about those who stayed? Even after the lawsuit, reports from watchdog organizations showed that many prisoners continued to suffer symptoms of mental decline. Some were too violent or unstable to move elsewhere. Others refused transfers, afraid that returning to general population would mean certain death. This paradox, choosing isolation over danger, shows the brutal calculus of prison psychology. At ADX Florence, survival means adapting to silence. One of the most haunting testimonies came from a man identified only as Inmate B. In his deposition he said, "You start talking to your mind like it's a separate person. Sometimes it answers. Sometimes it doesn't. But after a while you can't tell which one is you anymore." Dr. Haney later noted that this quote summarized the entire psychological impact of ADX Florence. It's not that they lose their freedom, they lose their sense of self. And yet, within that silence, some inmates cling to fragments of humanity, books, letters, memories of family. A few turn to religion, others to exercise or meditation. But no matter how they cope, the same truth remains. At ADX Florence, every man fights 2 wars, one against the system and one inside his own mind. To understand why ADX Florence exists, and why it continues to operate despite global condemnation, we have to go back to the 1980s and 1990s, when America's prison system was in chaos. At that time, violent assaults, riots, and murders inside federal prisons were at an all-time high. The Marion Federal Penitentiary in Illinois, once the highest security prison in the U.S., had become infamous after 2 guards were killed in 1983 by members of the Aryan Brotherhood. The response from the Bureau of Prisons was immediate and severe. The entire facility was locked down indefinitely. Prisoners spent 23 hours a day in their cells, a policy that would later become the blueprint for ADX Florence. This permanent lockdown model marked the birth of what experts now call the Supermax era. By the early 1990s, America's tough-on-crime policies had flooded prisons beyond capacity. The public demanded safety, politicians promised control. The solution seemed simple: create a facility where the most dangerous and disruptive inmates could be contained under total surveillance, away from the rest of the system. So in 1994, the federal government poured $60 million into building a new kind of prison. One that combined the architectural precision of a laboratory with the psychological intensity of isolation. The result was ADX Florence, nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies. It was more than a prison, it was a philosophy made of concrete. Warden John Hurley, one of ADX's early administrators, once described the facility's purpose in stark terms. "This is where we send the worst of the worst. If they can't behave anywhere else, they come here. And once they're here, we control every breath they take." The control wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Every design decision at ADX was intended to remind inmates that they had no power, no privacy, no choice, and no escape. The cells were soundproofed. The corridors were lined with motion sensors. The mirrors in the control center allowed officers to observe inmates without being seen. The idea was to prevent violence by removing every opportunity for human contact. But what the designers didn't account for was that removing humanity doesn't create order. It creates emptiness. Former guards began speaking out years later about what they witnessed behind those walls. Officer Joseph D'Angelo, who worked at ADX for 8 years, told reporters, "You can see it in their eyes. The ones who've been there too long, their gaze goes hollow. They don't look at you, they look through you." Even the staff weren't immune. Studies later revealed that correctional officers working in extreme isolation units suffered higher rates of anxiety, insomnia, and PTSD compared to those in standard prisons. Constant surveillance, tension, and exposure to psychological trauma created what one expert called secondhand confinement. The Bureau of Prisons defended its approach by pointing to statistics. ADX had one of the lowest rates of staff assaults and inmate homicides in the entire system. But those numbers told only half the story. Behind the metrics of safety lay a hidden epidemic of mental deterioration. A 2013 internal review found that over 40% of ADX inmates showed signs of serious psychological distress, yet less than 10% were receiving active treatment. Therapy sessions, when granted, took place through metal mesh barriers. Psychiatrists spoke to inmates via intercom systems while guards stood nearby, an environment hardly suited for healing. Even some of the prison's original architects began to voice regret. John Haviland, a consultant who had helped design the control systems, later admitted in an interview, "We built it to contain danger. But over time, it became a place that manufactures suffering." As the years went on, ADX became a symbol, a warning, a deterrent, a message that no matter how powerful or feared you were, the government could put you in a box and make the world forget you existed. The public perception of justice evolved with it. For decades, Americans viewed ADX through the lens of retribution, that the people inside deserved whatever came their way. But as reports of psychological breakdowns, suicides, and human rights violations began to surface, the narrative started to shift. By the 2010s, journalists and human rights advocates were calling for oversight. The American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, released a 2014 report describing ADX as a modern dungeon where isolation is weaponized. Even international bodies took notice. The United Nations Committee Against Torture expressed deep concern about conditions at ADX and urged the U.S. to reconsider its use of prolonged solitary confinement. Still, ADX remained open and continued to expand. When El Chapo Guzman was sentenced in 2019, his transfer to ADX was celebrated by U.S. prosecutors as the ultimate punishment. Yet, Mexican officials criticized the move, calling it psychological annihilation disguised as security. The paradox is clear. The prison meant to protect society now stands accused of eroding the very principles of justice it was built to uphold. Warden Robert Hood, who once oversaw the facility, later summarized the dilemma best. ADX was built for control. But after years of watching men crumble inside those walls, I realized, control without compassion becomes cruelty. And so, even among those who helped create ADX Florence, doubt began to grow. The most infamous minds of modern crime live, or once lived, inside ADX Florence. Each one arrived as a symbol of power, ideology, or notoriety. But inside those walls, every identity dissolves into the same silence. The Unabomber, Theodore Kaczynski. When Theodore Kaczynski, the Harvard-trained mathematician who waged an 18-year mail bomb campaign, was sentenced to life without parole in 1998, the Bureau of Prisons sent him straight to ADX. To the world, he was a brilliant recluse turned terrorist. Inside Florence, he became inmate 04475-046. His cell contained nothing but concrete, a metal sink, and his own thoughts. Kaczynski once wrote to his pen pal David Skrbina that the silence was so perfect it hums. He spent hours composing letters by hand, analyzing the psychology of solitude itself. 4 years, prison logs noted his impeccable discipline. No outbursts, no incidents, yet psychiatrists who reviewed his correspondence saw evidence of growing withdrawal and self-erasure. When he died by suicide in 2023, after nearly a quarter-century of isolation, one former psychologist said, "He didn't lose his mind, he folded it inward until nothing was left but equations and silence." Ramzi Youssef, the architect of terror. Across the corridor lived Ramzi Youssef, the man behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. He spends 23 hours a day alone, forbidden from contact even with other terrorists. According to declassified court documents, Youssef requested a copy of the Quran and an Arabic dictionary, his only permitted possessions for years. An FBI official who observed him during transport hearings in the early 2000s recalled, "He stared straight ahead, unblinking. It wasn't defiance, it was emptiness." Psychiatrists note that prolonged sensory deprivation can flatten affect until emotion disappears entirely. Reports from 2017 showed Youssef communicating only through brief written notes, sentences stripped of personality as if authored by a machine. Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. Then there's Richard Reed, the British-born extremist who tried to detonate a bomb hidden in his shoe aboard American Airlines Flight 63 in 2001. At ADX, Reed's faith became both lifeline and torment. Guards say he prayed 5 times daily facing a wall of gray stone. Denied communal worship, he began speaking his prayers aloud for hours. After months of complaints, officials allowed him a single Quranic broadcast via closed-circuit television. But letters obtained through the Freedom of Information Act reveal he later begged to stop receiving it, writing, "The voices of recitation echo off these walls until they no longer sound human." Dzhokhar Tsarnaev and the New Generation. The youngest among them, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber, entered ADX in 2015 at just 21. Court filings describe his unit, H-Unit, as the most restrictive section of the entire prison. There, human contact is virtually non-existent. Even his meals slide through mechanized slots controlled from a remote booth. Experts who have reviewed conditions warn that placing someone so young in total isolation virtually guarantees irreversible psychological damage. Patterns in the silence. Each of these cases exposes the same pattern. No matter the crime, the human brain rebels against perpetual stillness. Dr. Terry Kupers calls it the collapse of narrative. He explains, "Every person maintains a mental story that gives life meaning. Solitary confinement tears that story apart until nothing connects. You lose context and with it, the self." Records show that many ADX inmates develop obsessive routines, counting floor tiles, repeating phrases, pacing exact distances. It's not madness in the cinematic sense, it's survival through control. But over years, those coping rituals harden into compulsions. A 2020 study by the Journal of Trauma and Dissociation found that over half of former ADX prisoners displayed symptoms of complex PTSD even years after release. Intrusive memories, disorientation, emotional numbness, and in some cases suicidal ideation triggered by silence itself. The human cost. Correctional officers see the transformation firsthand. One retired lieutenant told the Denver Post, "They come in angry and dangerous. After 5 years they're quiet. After 10 they're ghosts." He paused before adding, "Some of us become ghosts too." Even guards who rotate through ADX's control rooms report lingering anxiety from the constant surveillance, the endless camera feeds, the responsibility to monitor men dissolving before their eyes. In the end, ADX Florence doesn't merely contain criminals, it studies the threshold of the human psyche. It asks, implicitly, how much isolation a person can bear before existence itself becomes punishment. And the answers keep getting darker. ADX Florence was built to contain the violent. But over time, it became a mirror, reflecting the violence of isolation itself. Behind those walls, punishment goes beyond bars and concrete. It seeps into memory, identity, and the fragile boundaries of the mind. Even the toughest inmates, men who once ruled empires of crime, eventually face the same enemy, silence. And that silence always wins. As Warden Robert Hood once said, ADX is a clean version of hell. It's not about death. It's about forgetting how to live. For decades, America's justice system has wrestled with the question: do we lock men away to protect society, or to erase them from it? At ADX Florence, that question is answered every day, in every echoing corridor, in every man who forgets his own reflection. If you found this story powerful, don't just scroll away. Hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because on this channel we bring you real stories from the darkest corners of the justice system. From America's deadliest prisons to the minds that survived them, our mission is to expose the truth, not fiction. This has been Behind Bars TV, where every wall has a story. Candle until next time, stay aware, stay human, and never stop asking what justice really means.